Speaking of which, Sherwin Bryce-Peace is in the house. That's when you know it's getting serious. He, of course, is part of the team that's going to be helping us make sense of this moment, because what a moment it is. And think there's no over-emphasizing how important it is, not only for South Africa, but for the rest of the continent, because there are important issues that the Global South is hoping will ultimately reach the world stage. And I'm sure, there's going to be a lot of interest to get a sense of how many of those ultimately see the light of day.
Look, South Africa is a country that has always punched above its weight, Ayanda. I think just look at our sports teams and look at the bragging rights that our rugby team has engendered, certainly over the last year. And I think that inspires everything else. It inspires citizenry around the country, but it also inspires our government to show up in this moment. It is the first G20 Summit at a leaders level ever to be hosted on the African continent, a first for South Africa. And so everything must go well. Microphones must work, security must be good, the protests can protest, but they mustn't disrupt too much in terms of what the leaders and the substance that needs to be discussed. And then, with all the fanfare and theatre behind us, which will happen on Sunday, what then happens? How do you take forward the decision-making processes that have, in terms of the development agenda that South Africa has put at the centre of this process, right? Dealing with disaster resilience, dealing with critical minerals, innovation, infrastructure, all those things is about improving people's lives. And at the end of the day, all of this is about the citizenry around the world, right, and how you improve and uplift people. And so that must be the end game here, despite everything else that's going on around us. Yeah, and the president has been at pains to explain their approach here, which is to be as inclusive as possible. And in fact, he says he's drawn criticism for that. I think some commentary around this being a G100 and not necessarily being a G20 summit. Well, that's what inclusion looks like. When you talk about solidarity, equality, and sustainability, what does that actually mean? It means diversity, it means equity, it means inclusion. And so in terms of addressing the social ills, whether that be in terms of climate justice, whether that be in terms of food security systems, and the list goes on, how do you ensure that you actually are able to achieve that goal, right? What the framework that has been provided by what's known as the 2030 Development Agenda. And so when you talk about dealing with those intractable issues like poverty, like gender inequality, like climate justice, you need an all-of-society approach. That's been the theme of this G20. And yes, the United States has expressed its opposition to that theme. But how do you actually achieve the things you are talking about if you do not have an all-inclusive process, an all-society approach? And I think that's what the South Africans have sought to do here. Yeah. I imagine the skeptics are on standby to just, categorize this as nothing but another talk shop. And that's because often there's a feeling that these are very high-level discussions around these heads of state. You spoke about the performance, really, that South Africa has to put on. And after that, everybody just gets back to their normal lives again. In fact, part of the criticism is that often from one presidency to another, all you have is a declaration, right, and the next country kind of takes over from there. I can't help but wonder whether this is an opportunity for us to do anything differently this time. Well, what is our responsibility as the media, right, in terms of keeping them to what they've agreed to? Right. What is our process of follow-up in terms of what the declaration says, or the lack of a declaration, maybe a chair's statement, right, given the context we're operating in? But what is our responsibility as the media in terms of holding them accountable? This is why you have a social summit, right? Civil society is often the spear, the head of the spear in terms of holding government accountable. So that element is also very important. But what is our role as the media, right? You had a M20 briefing with the president this week. Our responsibility is to hold them to account. Like you said you were going to do this, how's it going? Or do our own investigations, right? Our network of people and interlocutors that understand this process. We need to broaden our perspective in terms of who we talk to as the media. We don't want the officialdom only. We also want to talk to civil society, the business community, maybe sports teams around the world about excellence and how we can actually implement things. Yeah. This summit was almost overshadowed by the Trump factor. I think we all know that if Donald Trump was coming, I think we'd be doing a whole lot more speaking about him. But I do wonder just how all of this is landing in the US, if it's featuring at all, given their own dynamics at the moment. I hate to say it, but it's obviously not going to feature as much with the absence of the United States president, because where the president goes and what the president does is essentially what sucks the media's attention in. So he was hosting the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia yesterday, and so they're talking about that. Congress just released has called on the Justice Department through overwhelming votes in both the House and the Senate to release the Epstein files. That's the big conversation there. If he is, we're one social media post away from being relevant in terms of coverage there. So make no mistake, the absence of the United States doesn't mean they're not going to inject themselves, even from a distance in this process. So, this is why the security arrangements and the microphones working and the smooth running of everything is so important. Because remember, we're not just showcasing South Africa within that context, right? The negativity that you've heard from the US, but also within the African continent and the African context. And so our goal, I think, as South Africans is really to put on a good show. And we've done that before. We hosted the World Cup. We've hosted major events before. This is not new to us. The question is, what will the United States say, and who will say it, and when will they say it, and how will we cover it?
Because we know something is likely to be said. Yeah.
Something's coming.
We've seen this before. I want to go back to some of those salient issues that we thought are likely to be top of mind, for lack of a better term. You spoke about the critical minerals question, right? The concept of beneficiation. Perhaps we can speak a bit more about that. But also this idea of making sure that there's the kind of funding that isn't debilitating for African countries. I know that's also been an important issue.
Right, so the big conversation is going to be around the global financial architecture and where the money going to come from.
Right.
How are we going to pay for this, right? When you talk about a $4 trillion, annual $4 trillion gap in terms of SDG implementation, in terms of the financing that is required to deal with things like poverty and food insecurity and good health care and universal education and all those things that engender the SDG and the 2030 agenda, how are we going to do that? It's a question of money. What is the role of developmental banks? We talk about concessional financing. Can they give loans that are not so punitive in terms of the interest rate repayments that you would get from the market or the private sector? Concessional financing is going to be very important. Collaboration, solidarity is what South Africa's been talking about. But in that vein, what does solidarity look like in terms of critical minerals and the supply chains around that, and ensuring that beneficiation happens here? Beneficiation essentially means we are not going to export the raw material, we are going to process that raw material toward an end product so that we can then sell that at a higher cost and create jobs in South Africa, create the supply chains and the infrastructure around the extraction of that mineral. Who's cleaning the mineral? Who's supplying the food for the people that are working around that mine? What small company can benefit from supplying one component of what is needed in a factory around that process, right? I mean, it's quite layered. And so what you don't want to do is take the raw material and export it and say, we're done here. There is a process that can really engender economic growth, deal with endemic levels of unemployment in a context like South Africa. And what does that infrastructure trade look like within the African continent? Because we're not the only country with critical minerals. There's the DRC, there's places north of that, Sudan and others. How do we ensure that we create wealth from the wealth that is under our feet?
Anybody who's been following conversations around the global architecture of things will say this is not new. This is actually not a new discussion.
No.
And I wonder what, at this point, is going to ultimately shift the dial. I mean, is South Africa hosting the G20 enough for us to feel like we're having a different discussion?
Let me tell you why. If they miss this opportunity, that will be on them, because the critical minerals are the central theme to an economic future and the direction we're heading in terms of AI, in terms of data centers that are going to power artificial intelligence, robotics, satellite communications, these magnets, I don't know all the names, but these are very critical things in electric vehicles,
yes,
battery components,
right.
All that kind of, that's the future. The future is under our feet. Yes, China's got critical minerals, Brazil's got critical minerals, but South Africa also has critical minerals, the DRC, Sudan, others. How do we ensure that we don't miss the boat? And remember, there was a report done under the auspices of the UN Secretary General, but one of the chairs of that report was Ambassador Mkakato Diseko, the former permanent representative in Geneva at the UN. And she led this process about how we ensure that our critical minerals are going to benefit, you're not going to evaporate the benefit by exporting things. And so that report is going to be very much critical to the discussions that happened this week.
Yeah. South Africa undoubtedly on show, Africa on show.
Yes, sir.
But I would argue multilateralism also on show, right? And it's been a bumpy year insofar as that is concerned. We've seen in many instances people feeling let down by multilateral institutions like the United Nations. There's been real questions about how the IMF works. I mean, we spoke about, sustainable funding, et cetera, the list goes on. And here we are again, where we'll be presented with an opportunity to see whether or not this actually works for the people, so to speak.
So the problem with multilateralism is that it is consensus-based. You need to create the largest and broadest consensus, and then then the implementation problem is the big problem. Do countries as individual countries or on a bilateral basis implement the decisions that have been taken at a multilateral fora? And often that is the problem. If you look at the SDGs, for example, SDGs were adopted in 2015. You have a 35% implementation rate. We are so off track in terms of this deadline that is looming in 2030 in dealing with poverty, food security, health, climate, and the list goes on. We're off track. And so multilateralism has been good in terms of delivering a product, a declaration, a resolution, a process, that a pathway towards achieving something, and then the pathway falls flat.
Right.
Look at where we are in terms of gender equality. Look at in terms of where we are in terms of climate justice. The blueprint is there. It's called the SDGs. Read the 17 development goals and tell me if that doesn't align with what they're trying to achieve anew in a process here at the G20, because we've not. So the means of implementation becomes important. That's why the financial issue is the big issue here. That is the critical mineral that we need in the G20, is how we're going to pay for things. Absolutely. Money still making the world go around. Sherwin, you and I will have many, many opportunities to speak about all these very important issues. For now, thanks very much indeed. I'm sure if you keep up with many of our platforms, Sherwin is likely to pop up on the next one. So stay logged to SABC News as, of course, we continue with our G20 coverage.